Hello, my name is Dean Contover, and this is the Current Buzz. Today we have Dr. Robert Forrant. He's from the University of Massachusetts. Are you the head of the history department, or you?
Oh no, I wouldn't want that mantle. I'm the director of the graduate program in the history department.
Oh, the graduate.
That's bad enough.
Okay. So, how did you wind up in Lowell? I mean, your education, before we talk about the history of Lowell.
Yep. I was the first person in my family to go to college, actually.
Okay.
Grandparents, immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Quebec.
Wow.
And a big family. I was the oldest, 3 sisters and a brother. First person in my family to go to college. Went to Northeastern University because it was cheap then, not like today. And it had co-op and whatever. And then when I finished up, I wanted to be a high school social studies teacher, but it was at a point when the Massachusetts economy was in a pretty low ebb. Nobody was hiring teachers, so I decided to go to graduate school. I got my master's degree at Northeastern, and then I went on to UMass Amherst to get a PhD. Along the way, while I was in grad school in Amherst, I had a house fire and I lost all my research, so I actually quit school. And I went to work as a machinist for a number of years at a place in Springfield called American Bosch, making auto parts and airplane parts and such.
That's a common name, Bosch, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it was a subsidiary of the Bosch company in Germany. But
okay,
became American Bosch during the Second World War, and then we didn't give it back.
Oh, okay, as usual.
And so I quit school. I worked for a number of years as a machinist. Then the factory that I was working in closed. Went back to school, got my PhD, and shortly afterwards I got hired at UMass Lowell. And I've been there this is my 25th year this year.
Congratulations, wow, good for you.
Roundabout way.
Yeah, so you live in Lowell, or you live?
I do live in Lowell.
Okay.
I lived, actually, believe it or not, I commuted for a few years from Holyoke, Massachusetts. My kids were in middle school when I got the job, and I didn't want to have to relocate them. That's precious time for kids, whatever,
right.
And so I made the commitment to drive back and forth.
Wow.
And when they finished high school, went off to college, and I decided, okay, well, time to move.
And they're doing well.
They're doing well.
Oh, good. That's
better
good.
than me, I hope. But anyway, they're doing well.
That's good. That's good. How many children did you say? 2.
Daughter and a son.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I didn't know that you wrote the book for 1912, Bread and Roses.
Yes.
That happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about?
Well, part of my interest is in labor history.
Okay.
And the 1912 strike in Lawrence, the Bread and Roses strike, is probably one of the most famous strikes in American history. And 2012 was going to be the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the strike. So I'm on the board of the Lawrence History Center. Okay. And the History Center itself decided to do a number of commemorative events all across 2012 to remember the strike, to create a history exhibit on the strike, and do a bunch of other things. And so one of the byproducts of that was to write this book for Arcadia with a lot of images. And then I wrote a more academic book that probably 9 people read, but the Arcadia book sold more books than any book I've ever written, partly because it's cheap. It's only
cheap,
like $10 or whatever.
It's a pictorial.
Yeah.
And people like that.
Yeah, no, and it's fascinating. When it came out, I got contacted by Costco. They wanted to know if I wanted to do a book signing in Costco, right? Because they sell Arcadia books. And I thought, this is really interesting. I've never done such a thing. So I went to Costco just before Christmas in 2013. The book had been out just a little while into 2013. They set me up in the aisle, and they kept bringing me all the food samples they have there and everything. I was living like a king, and so many people bought the book.
You're kidding me.
And people who had, my mom or my grandma or whatever, lived in Lawrence, and my great-grandfather was in the strike. And so it ended up being one of the best days ever, because I love talking to people about their stories. And I was just being, at one point there was a line. I said, this is crazy.
Wow.
And I did it in a way almost like on a lark, because I thought, well, it'll just be an experience, right?
Right.
Maybe I'll sell one book or whatever. And No, it wasn't the case. They had a big display in the aisle, and I was sitting there, like I say, with food
Right,
and beverage and signing books and talking to
So
people.
how long
it
were
was
you there
grand.
for, signing books?
I was there I was supposed to only be there for an hour, and I ended up staying for over 2 hours.
Wow.
Because there were so many people that kept, each time I got ready to go, somebody else came along, and then
Okay.
finally I said, okay, time to go. And I packed up. But they were very
Interesting.
gracious. It was really good
I'm going to have to pick up the book. Will you sign it for me?
I'll sign it for you for sure, yeah.
Okay, good. We want to talk about Lowell history. It's the 200th anniversary of General Butler.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to the audience, without boring them, about General Butler. A very simple story, like you would teach a 101 course.
Okay, sure.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
so Ben Butler is probably one of Lowell's most famous, or depending on which part of America you come from, infamous citizens. Not a well-liked character in the southern United States because he was very much involved in the prosecution of the Civil War in the South and part of an occupation of New Orleans toward the end of the war, and a whole bunch of other sort of history related to the Civil War. He's also an interesting character earlier than that. Usually people only talk about his Civil War exploits,
Right.
but he's not born in Lowell, but his dad dies when Ben Butler is pretty young. His mom moves to Lowell and and operates a boarding house for young women who work in the Lowell mills.
Right. Yeah, that's
And
part of the
Butler-
history of Lowell.
Yeah. And Butler lives in the boarding house. Butler's a graduate of Lowell High School.
Okay.
And he goes on to college, what's now Colby College, and comes back to Lowell to read law. There weren't law schools the same way as now. You just hook yourself up with a lawyer back then and you do what's called reading law. And then you basically go in front of a judge and the judge grills you about whether you know your stuff or not. And if you do, then you can practice law.
Oh, wow.
So he gets his ability to practice law. He opens up with other people a law office in a fancy building on downtown Merrimack Street, literally around the corner from where he's living at the time, on Central Street, and he becomes a very colorful character in Lowell's early history from 1840 to 1860.
Lowell was established or incorporated in 1836, is that correct? And it became a city with picking up parcels from Dracut, Tewksbury, and Chelmsford?
Correct.
Right.
So there really isn't, there is no Lowell in the early 19th century. The developers of mills, cotton mills, have built several enterprises close to Boston, and they're using the Charles River. And
Slow Charles River.
the slow Charles River. It runs through Waltham. It's not powerful enough. They built their mills. They can't build anymore because there's no more energy. And they basically send people out looking for other rivers, other places. And they send people out and they find the double falls that are now in what we think of as Lowell. One by South Campus of the university, one by North Campus of the university.
Pawtucket Falls.
Yeah, and so they find those falls, and they slowly start buying up the land from farmers. And they don't tell them that they're going to build mills, because then maybe the farmers would want more money.
Right.
They just pretend that they're farmers looking for land. And a lot of the land along the riverway that they buy is apple orchards, peach orchards, pear orchards, and it's pretty devoid of trees. It's pretty, other than these orchards. And there's already a canal. The Middlesex Canal has already been built on the river. It sort of circumvents the falls, and then a Pawtucket Canal is built. And eventually then these guys start excavating more mills in the city, more canals, in the city, and then start building more mill buildings. The first buildings they build are in the late 1820s, the Hamilton Mills, which are over on Jackson Street. And then they keep building and building and building, and then they become really a wonder of the world. People come from all over the world in the 1830s to tour these textile mills in Lowell because there's nothing quite like them anywhere else.
In the United States, you mean, but
Yep.
but they were basically copied from England, is that
Yeah,
correct?
People stole the plans and the ideas and
That's-
then created these actually much bigger, more powerful, more machinery. And they also made adaptations on the machinery to make the machinery run faster, produce more cloth. They also owned this machine shop in Lowell that built the textile machinery they used. So they were very innovative and very clever in what they were doing. They imported lots of skilled workers to work in the machine shop, and then slowly lots of immigrant workers started coming to the city as well.
Well, they were unskilled.
They would have been largely unskilled. First groups of people are largely Irish, escaping the potato famine and other things that are happening in Ireland. They're going to be the diggers of the canals. They're going to do a lot of the construction work on building the mills. And then sort of running parallel to that workforce coming in are young women coming to Lowell, women that would have lived in Ben Butler's mom's boarding house.
Right.
And they're going to be the first workforce in the mills. So the city grows pretty quickly from nothing to, in the mid-1820s to by 1836, several thousand people. It's incorporated. There are, by that point, about a dozen textile mills in the city, several miles of canals, and it's a pretty thriving metropolis, and that's basically where Butler sets down his roots to practice law.
Right, right. Are you familiar with the Highland section of Lowell? That was part of Chelmsford, right? Are you familiar with there's a monument off of Pine Street that says the first white girl born in Chelmsford? Are you familiar with that?
No, I don't know that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to have to find it.
I'm going to have to show it to you.
All right, I'll have to find it.
Yeah.
Every time you ride around Lowell, you find another marker or something, or there's a square named after somebody.
You would never know where it is. It's right next to an apartment building. It's like 2 or 3 feet from the apartment building, and it's set into the ground right there. Yeah, I'll have to take you there.
Yeah, I would not know that, so that would be worth checking out.
Recently, they had a dedication in regards to Butler, right? And did you go to his gravesite on Hildreth Street, the Hildreth Cemetery?
I did not go this time, but I've been before.
Oh, you've been there before. Yep. I was not aware of it, even though I lived in Lowell, that Gerald Butler and the monument was at least 2 stories high. And I'll tell you, the only reason I learned of it is a friend of mine told me that he knew somebody that cut the grass there, and he had the key to the gate. Yeah. And he would go in and cut the grass.
I got in that way. That's how I got in.
Oh, is that right? So would you wait for the guy to?
Well, it's a private cemetery within a cemetery.
Right, and you would never know it.
Yeah, no, I live in Centerville, so it's not that far. If I'm going to Hannaford's and Draycott, I kind of ride by it.
Yeah, right.
Being curious, being a historian, being curious, I knew the Hildreth Cemetery, and Butler marries into the Hildreth family.
Right.
So that's how he ends up.
That's how it's off of Hildreth Street, Hildreth Cemetery, and so forth.
And so he marries the Hildreth girl, and then ends up buried in the.
You have a book, right? Yep. It's what is the book?
So this is called this tome. I mean, I think it weighs like 3.5 pounds or something like that. This is called Butler's Book.
Right.
So toward the end of Butler's life, Butler dies in the late 1880s. He decides he wants to compile his life, and so this is his autobiography.
Right.
And so he assembled in this book remnants of his life, documents, old photographs, little stories from here and there in his travels. And it's a goldmine for historians who are interested.
I have that in my library. I have that book in my library.
You have to take some of it with a grain of salt, as you do with most autobiographies. People become much larger in their own autobiography than they might be.
Is that right?
Yeah, in other people's minds.
I'll remember that when you write yours.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll ever write a biography is probably more truthful because the historian kind of navigates between myth and reality.
Right.
But what's good about this is, I was asked for this commemoration in November to dig into
2018.
This one just now.
Yeah, I just want to get on record.
Yep, sorry. Yeah. I was asked to look into more of what Butler's record was on issues of labor in Lowell. And I know Butler, again, sort of the way we started the program. I know the Civil War exploits, and he ran for president in 1884. He was a member of the House of Representatives. I knew all that, but I really wasn't that aware.
He was governor of Massachusetts at one time, too.
He was a governor for a term. He was in the U.S. House. He was in the state Senate for a term from Lowell before the Civil War. And so in this, and then I started reading newspapers and other things and biographies. It turns out Butler was very much an advocate for working people in Lowell before the Civil War. and it put him up against a lot of the big shots in Lowell.
That he knew.
That were maybe his friends in one way, but in another way he was their adversary when it came to court cases or it came to advocating for workers. And particularly, he was a strong advocate, one of the really leading advocates in the city for the 10-hour workday. That doesn't seem like much now to people watching the program, but in the 1830s, a typical young woman working in the mills in Lowell would have worked 5 12-hour days and a 6-hour day on Saturday. That would have been thought of as a normal work week, somewhere between 65 and 70 hours.
Right.
And so moving to a 10-hour workday was seen as progressive change and a serious and a real reform.
Right.
And he doesn't completely in this say why, but as a historian, what we usually try to do is compile the evidence and then sort of try to figure out what makes sense. And I do believe that because he lived for a while in the boarding house with his mom, and the boarding house was occupied by young women working in the mills, he saw their exhaustion. He heard them talking about how difficult their workday was, and he developed an empathy for their condition. And then as a lawyer, he began to become an advocate because he had some deeper understanding than some of his other friends. Linus Child, who was a mill overseer, other people like that, Kirk Boot, while he was alive, they would have been people that would not have been happy with Mr. Butler.
So he was advocate for these workers, and they also put their I'm trying to find the word, but they also put it in writing, right? Mm-hmm. And would they have the old Lowell offering? What's the story behind that?
Yep. So young women start. So there's two newspapers, two sort of literary outlets for young women as they're working in the mills. The Lowell Offering, which is started indirectly a lot by the companies to become a place where young women can write poetry and short stories and things like that. And then roughly around the same time period, another newspaper gets started called The Voice of Industry. The Voice of Industry is much more pro-worker, much more anti-company, much more engaged in the politics of the day. They're fighting for women's right to vote. In the 1840s in the newspaper, they're fighting for the 10-hour day, and they're also fighting against slavery. And so that newspaper is much more progressive than the Lowell Offering is, but they exist side by side.
Speaking of slavery, didn't they have Underground Railroad in Lowell?
Yep.
Okay.
There are.
And how did that work out? Where was the rat line to that? And did I go to Canada? Is that what?
So several of the churches in Lowell, the ministers in those churches were outspoken against the institution of slavery.
Right.
Which is very interesting in the city because Lowell's a cotton mill city.
Right.
And Lowell doesn't exist without cotton, and cotton in America doesn't exist without the labor of enslaved people.
Good point.
And so side by side, and so it's curious because even somebody like Linus Child, who I mentioned a second ago, who is not in favor of the 10-hour day and goes to war with Butler on that one, Child is also an anti-slavery advocate, even though he's an overseer of a cotton mill. He's a Quaker. And he brings some of that with him the question of, so Lowell's a peculiar place during this period of time. But the Underground Railroad, so amongst other places where there were several stops in Pawtucketville, in farmhouses and places out away from the downtown. But St. Anne's Church on Merrimack Street, the beautiful church.
Episcopalian church.
Yep, right in the middle of downtown. That had an Underground Railroad stop in a sub-basement.
No kidding.
Of the church, which I've crawled around in. One day, the caretaker of the church brought me down in there, and
that's interesting.
Could look at it for myself.
Right.
And what would happen would be, if people were fleeing from the South, a lot of times they would end up in New York City. From New York City, people who knew contacts would send people to Boston, and then they might come further north to Andover, then maybe to Lowell, someplace else in southern New Hampshire. They would sort of stay in these places for a little while and make their way. And so a number of people ended up in St. Anne's Church. We know because Theodore Edson, who was the first minister of the church when it was built and was the minister there for decades, kept journals. and he wrote.
Oh, wow.
And so there are some passages I've read where he talks about a person being sent from New York to Boston to Andover to Lowell.
And then to Canada.
And then he sort of describes, a lot of fugitives also ended up staying in Lowell. They actually didn't leave. There were several fugitives that owned barbershops, hairdressing salons,
Oh, wow.
Newspaper stands, fruit stands, things like that, who basically found Lowell a comfortable place to stay. And it was pretty common knowledge in the city that they were fugitives. But they were living they were living in the downtown of the city. So a lot of on Central Street, on Dutton Street, for people that are familiar with Lowell, sort of the main drags even back then as they are today. They're hairdresser shops, barber shops, newspaper stands.
It's interesting that you talk about Lowell. Lowell doesn't have a Revolutionary War history, of course, because they were incorporated after. But every community has a history of the Civil War, whether it's Chelmsford or whether it's Billerica, whether it's Westford. But Lowell has a unique history because they allege the first northern soldiers were killed in the Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War. And they have a monument in downtown Lowell in front of
right in front of City Hall.
Right. And they're buried there, the two soldiers, well, three soldiers.
There's three people
There's
buried.
three people. Yeah. Laden, Whitney, and...
I don't know who the third person is. They'd be good on Jeopardy. Final Jeopardy. Who's the third person buried?
Interesting. So real quick, we have 3 minutes in regards to the first soldiers. A lot of people, I didn't even know as a young boy that there were soldiers killed in the Baltimore riots.
Yes. My friend Dick Howe's a much better expert on this one than me, but Butler is responsible, and other people in Lowell are responsible for, as the war loomed, creating some of the first trained divisions. And when war breaks out, they're ready to go, and so they're on a train, and they get to Baltimore, and Baltimore trains are very much like Boston, where you have a South Station and a North Station.
Right.
And so they get to the North Station part of Baltimore, and they have to march through the city of Baltimore to get to the other train station to get further south.
Right.
And while they're marching, people are sniping at them, and Laden and Whitney are both killed. They're initially buried there, and then after the war, they're brought back in their put. I've often joked with my students that I'd like to get like some kind of a camera and like actually put it in there and see whether they're really in there or not. Sort of like we take it on faith, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Kind of like Al Capone's vault or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could see the casket sort of sticking out of the monument.
Yeah, the way it's built.
The way it's built and so forth.
But yeah, so I mean, this history is, Lowell has this great history. I mean, I'm right now writing a book on the immigration history of Lowell. And I'm forever finding just such incredible stuff because the immigration history of the city is just rich, and it continues.
Is this going to be a pictorial book?
No, this is going to be. This is going not this thick, but maybe half.
Oh, okay, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the history of Lowell in regards to what you find.
I can't have for me as an immigration historian and labor historian, there can't be a better place to teach.
Wow, good point.
I can't think of a better place to be anywhere in the country.
Right.
I could think of places that might be like it, but I can't think of any place that would be better.
You know what? Another history that's lacking is regards to the veterans that served out of Lowell. I mean, there's a bit large communities. I mean, there were a lot of French Canadians, Italians who went into World War II that became Americanized. Greek Americans, a Jewish community. I mean, it was all encompassing.
Yeah, and what you find are it seems like every other square in Lowell is named for veterans of either World War I or World War II. So there's a lot of that.
Chelmsford doesn't do that too bad.
But in Lowell, though, while you have all that, there's very little signage to explain. So sometimes in my history classes, I've had students go to the newspapers.
Research.
Okay, who's that? Come in with a list and say, okay, who is that person?
That's a good point.
Go to the newspaper and figure out who they are.
I think that's great.
It's a way for them to do historical research, and using the newspapers, they can figure out, they can find the